Welcome back. Let's start with recognizing an argument. So how do you recognize an argument? Not all arguments follow the same order. For instance, the conclusion might be stated first and the premise stated afterwards in support of the conclusion. This is perfectly valid, if sometimes a little confusing. Arguments are harder to recognize than premises or conclusions. Many people shower their writing with assertions without ever producing anything which one might reasonably describe as an argument. Some statements look like arguments, but they're not. Well, one example that a lot of people tend to use: God created you, therefore your duty is to God. The phrase "do your duty to God" is neither true or false. Therefore, it is not a proposition. The sentence is not an argument. The second part is simply an assertion. In logic, causality is important. Suppose you are trying to argue that something is wrong with the engine of a car. Consider two statements of the form A because B. The first statement: my car will not start because there is something wrong with the engine. This statement is not an argument for being something wrong with the engine. It is an explanation of why the car will not start. We are explaining A using B as the explanation. We cannot argue from A to B using a statement of the form A because B. However, we can argue from B to A. Such a statement, consider this: there must be something wrong with the engine of my car because it will not start. Here we are arguing from A, offering B as an evidence. The statement A because B is then an argument. Now, to make the difference clear, note that A because B is equivalent to B before, therefore A. The two statements then become: there's something wrong with the engine, therefore my car will not start. And my car will not start, therefore there's something wrong with the engine. If we remember that we are supposed to be arguing that there's something wrong with the engine, it is clear that only the second statement is valid. A little confusing at first, but still valid. Implication in detail. There is one very important thing to remember. The fact that a deductive argument is valid does not imply that its conclusion holds. Remember what I said earlier about different arguments? This is because the slightly counterintuitive nature of implications, which we must now consider more carefully. A valid argument must consist of true propositions. True or false? False, because an argument may be entirely valid even if it contains only false prepositions. Let me give an example. All insects have wings. Premise. Woodlice are insects. Premise. Therefore, woodlice have wings. Conclusion. Here, the conclusion is not true because the argument's premise are false. Not all insects have wings. If the argument's premise are true, however, the conclusion would be true. The argument thus is entirely valid. Most certainly, we can reach a true conclusion for one or more false premise. Here's an example. All fish live in the sea. Premise. Dolphins are fish. Premise. Therefore, dolphins live in the sea. Conclusion. However, there is one thing wrong. The one thing we cannot do here is to reach a false conclusion through valid inferences from true premises. Dolphins are not fish, remember? A sound argument is a valid argument where premises are true. A sound argument, therefore, arrives at a true conclusion. Be careful not to confuse sound arguments with valid arguments. One thing to remember about argument: in everyday life, arguments are often offered for a purpose, and no one proposes an argument to prove himself wrong. All right? Fallacies. A fallacy is when your argument goes wrong. There are things that we believe to be true and make us think that something is true but are actually false. In simpler terms, they are when arguments appear to be valid but are in fact wrong. 1. Argumentum ad baculum, appeal to force. Or they say might makes right. In Malay, siapa kuat dialah kudrat. It is when the arguer says, if you don't believe me, I will do something bad to you. Now, that is not a valid argument. Next, we have argumentum ad hominem, argument directed at the man. This is when you say that something is wrong because of the person who is saying it. He is bad. He is bad, therefore what he says must be wrong. Then you have argumentum ad ignorantium, arguments from ignorance. This is when you argue that something must be true simply because it is not proven false. Or equivalently, when it is false, that something must be false because it has not been proven to be true. Okay, what he says must be true because you cannot prove that it is false. In law, this is called shifting the burden of proof from me to you. Then you have argumentum ad misericordiam. This is basically saying, asking for pity. I did not murder my friend. Please don't find me guilty. I'm suffering enough because my friends are dead. Is that logical? Argumentum ad populum. Sometimes some things must be true because many people believe it to be true. People use this argument in emotive language to appeal to the masses. For example, 1 billion people eat rice, therefore it must be good for you. Is it? Argumentum ad numerum. This is the same as argumentum ad populum, but it excites numbers. The true argument is the one that is supported by the bigger number of people. Then we have argumentum ad verecundiam, the appeal to authority. Uses the admiration of the famous to try and win the support for an assertion. Well, for example, Dr. Fadila said that children know that we give them credit. Remember, this kind of argument is not necessarily false, especially when the person cited is an authority in the field. But if it's not, then it's a different story. Now, there's a fallacy. Some fallacies are accidental. The fallacy of accident is committed when a general rule is applied to a particular case whose accidental circumstances mean that the rule is inapplicable. It is the error made when one goes from the general to the specific. For example, Malaysian team supporters dislike Bambang. You support the Malaysian team. You must therefore dislike Bambang. Of course, there's the opposite to that. There's the converse accident, hasty generalization. This fallacy is the reverse of the fallacy of accident. It occurs when one forms a general rule by examining only a few specific cases which are not representative of all possible cases. Coming back to football, my example, you are a disloyal Malaysian team supporter. Therefore, all Malaysian team supporters are disloyal. You don't believe that to be true, do you? And then there are sweeping generalizations, or dicto simpliciter. A sweeping generalization occurs when a general rule is applied to a particular situation in which the features of that particular situation renders the rule inapplicable. A sweeping generalization is the opposite of a hasty one. I think that is enough for now. So I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you.